Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
The rain falls gently over the city of Tbilisi, as though the heavens themselves are whispering secrets into the night. Cobblestone streets glisten beneath the dim glow of lanterns, their uneven stones carrying centuries of footsteps, prayers, and betrayals. The air is thick with mist, curling around the domes of ancient churches, wrapping the city in a veil of silence. It is here, in this timeless place, that the story begins, not with a gunshot nor with a shout, but with the quiet presence of a man whose name would one day echo across borders. Tariel Oniani. He was not introduced to the world with fanfare. His origins were obscured, his beginnings whispered only in fragments. Yet those who encountered him spoke of a peculiar aura, a gravity that seemed to bend the atmosphere around him. They said he could enter a crowded room and silence it without a word, his gaze alone enough to command attention. In the alleys of Tbilisi, where shadows stretched long and the rain carried the scent of earth and stone, his name began to circulate, not as a tale told loudly, but as a murmur passed from one cautious mouth to another. The city itself seemed to conspire with his legend. Tbilisi, with its blend of old and new, was a place where history pressed heavily upon the present. The crumbling facades of Soviet-era buildings stood beside medieval fortresses, each brick carrying the weight of survival. It was a city of contrasts, of devotion and despair, of beauty and corruption. And within this landscape, Oniani's presence grew like a shadow cast across the walls. Power in this world was not measured in gold or possessions. It was measured in silence, in the loyalty of men who would not speak his name aloud, and in the fear that lingered in the pause before a conversation resumed. Oniani understood this instinctively. He did not need to shout, nor did he need to display his strength. His power was in the unspoken, in the way others adjusted their posture when he passed, in the way doors seemed to open without him asking. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean yet leaving behind the residue of whispers. Somewhere in the city, a man lit a cigarette, its glow briefly illuminating his face before vanishing into the mist. Somewhere else, a deal was struck in hushed tones, promises exchanged beneath the cover of night. And always behind these moments, there was the suggestion of Oniani's influence, subtle yet undeniable. It is said that fate often announces itself quietly, long before its full weight is felt. In Tbilisi, fate was already moving, weaving threads of ambition and secrecy into the fabric of the city. Oniani's rise was not sudden, nor was it accidental. It was the slow unfolding of inevitability, like the steady drip of rain that carves rivers into stone. The churches stood silent, their bells muted, as though unwilling to disturb the unfolding of destiny. The river Mtkvari flowed steadily through the city, carrying with it reflections of bridges and towers, its waters dark and restless beneath the storm. In the quiet neighborhoods, families gathered around tables, speaking in hushed tones, while outside, figures moved through the night with purpose. The city was alive, yet it seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unseen. Oniani's presence was felt most strongly in these pauses, in the way men hesitated before speaking, in the way women lowered their voices when his name was mentioned. He was not yet the kingpin he would become, but already the atmosphere bent around him. He was a figure of fascination, a man whose silence spoke louder than words. The rain tapped against windows, against iron balconies, against the roofs of old houses. It was a rhythm, steady and patient, echoing the rhythm of Oniani's rise. Nothing about him was hurried. He moved with deliberation, with the calm assurance of someone who understood that power was not seized in a moment, but cultivated over time. And so the city became his stage. The mist, the rain, the silence, all conspired to create the perfect setting for a legend to take root. Those who lived in Tbilisi during those years would later recall the atmosphere, the sense that something was shifting beneath the surface. They would remember the way the streets seemed darker, the way conversations carried an edge of caution. They would remember the name whispered in the shadows, Tariel Oniani. The old neighborhoods of Salalaki and Avlabari carried echoes of his presence. In dimly lit taverns, men spoke of him in half-sentences, never daring to linger too long on the subject. In the markets, where vendors sold bread and fruit beneath dripping awnings, his name was carried like a rumor, fragile yet persistent. Even in the prisons, where stories of thieves-in-law were passed like sacred texts, Oniani's reputation began to take shape. What made him different was not merely ambition, but patience. He seemed to understand that true power was not in the act itself, but in the anticipation of it. He let silence do the work, let fear grow in the spaces between words. In this way, he became more than a man. He became a presence, a shadow that stretched across the city. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the rooftops, filling the gutters with rushing water. Yet even as the storm grew, the city remained hushed as though listening. Somewhere, a child pressed his face against a window, watching the mist swallow the streets. Somewhere else, an old man crossed himself, whispering a prayer for protection. And always, behind these moments, there was the suggestion of Oniani's story, waiting to be told. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with anticipation. The listener is left standing in the rain-soaked streets, gazing at the mist that hides more than it reveals. Somewhere beyond the fog, a figure moves, calm, deliberate, enigmatic. His story is only beginning, yet already it feels as though it has been written in the silence of centuries. And so, the shadows over Tbilisi deepen, inviting us to step closer, to listen more carefully, to follow the path of a man whose rise and fall would become legend. To understand the rise of Tariel Oniani, one must first step into the Georgia of his childhood. Imagine the narrow stairwells of Soviet apartment blocks, their walls painted in dull shades of green and gray, chipped from years of neglect. The smell of boiled potatoes and kerosene heaters filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of damp stone. These buildings were not homes in the Western sense, but collective shelters, each corridor echoing with the sounds of families enduring scarcity. It was here, in this atmosphere of quiet desperation, that Oniani's earliest lessons in survival were learned. Georgia was a land of contradictions. Its mountains stood eternal, their peaks crowned with snow, while its valleys carried vineyards and orchards that had fed generations. Yet beneath this natural beauty lay a society fractured by poverty and political uncertainty. The Soviet Union was a vast machine, and Georgia was one of its many cogs, small, overlooked, restless. For young men like Oniani, the streets were both a playground and a crucible. They offered lessons in cunning, in resilience, in the art of reading people's intentions before they spoke. In dimly lit kitchens, families gathered around tables, their conversations hushed, their hopes tempered by reality. Bread was shared carefully, tea poured sparingly, and every gesture carried the weight of endurance. Children grew up watching their parents navigate shortages, queues, and the quiet indignities of a system that promised much but gave little. It was in this environment that Oniani's hunger for control began to take shape. He saw the fragility of order, the cracks in authority, and he understood instinctively that power was not given, it was taken. The streets of Tbilisi taught lessons that no classroom could. Boys learned to fight not for glory, but for survival. They learned to negotiate, to bluff, to stand their ground when cornered. They learned that silence could be more powerful than words, and that reputation was a currency more valuable than rubles. Oniani absorbed these lessons with a quiet intensity. He was not the loudest, nor the most reckless, but he carried himself with a presence that others noticed. Even as a youth, there was something deliberate in his movements, something calculated in his gaze. The Soviet system, with its rigid hierarchies and hidden corruption, created fertile ground for men like him. Authority was both omnipresent and hollow. Officials demanded obedience, yet their own integrity was compromised. Rules existed, but they were bent, twisted, and broken daily. In such a world, the line between survival and crime blurred. To bend the rules was not rebellion, it was necessity. And for those who bent them with skill, opportunity awaited. Oniani's early encounters with the underworld were not dramatic. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first cracks in a wall that would one day collapse. A favor exchanged here, a debt collected there, a reputation slowly built among peers. He learned that influence was not about brute force, but about perception. If others believed you were strong, if they believed you were connected, then strength and connection became reality. The psychology of his rise was rooted in resilience. He had seen hardship and he had endured it. He had watched authority falter and he had recognized its weakness. He had felt the hunger of scarcity and he had resolved never to be powerless again. This hunger was not merely for wealth, but for control, for the ability to shape circumstances rather than be shaped by them. Georgia itself was changing. The Soviet Union was beginning to tremble, its foundations weakening under the weight of inefficiency and discontent. In the streets, whispers of independence mingled with whispers of opportunity. For young men like Oniani, the collapse of one order meant the birth of another. The old rules were fading, and in their place, new rules were being written. Rules of survival, rules of ambition, rules of the underworld. The atmosphere of his youth was one of quiet desperation, but also of possibility. Every dimly lit stairwell, every crowded marketplace, every hushed conversation carried the potential for something more. Oniani's charisma began to surface in these moments. He was not yet a leader, but he was someone others noticed, someone whose presence carried weight. He understood people, their fears, their desires, their weaknesses, and he began to use this understanding to his advantage. The seeds of ruthlessness were planted early. To survive in that world required a certain hardness, a willingness to act when others hesitated. Yet alongside this hardness was a charisma that drew people in. He could inspire trust even as he inspired fear. He could make others feel seen, even as he calculated how to use them. This duality, ruthlessness and charm, would become the foundation of his power. The neighborhoods of Tbilisi carried echoes of his presence. In Salilaki, with its fatting grandeur, and in Avlabari, with its working-class resilience, stories of young men testing boundaries were common. Oniani was among them, but he stood apart. His reputation grew not from reckless acts, but from deliberate ones. He seemed to understand that true power was not in the act itself, but in the anticipation of it. He let silence do the work, let fear grow in the spaces between words. The Soviet collapse was not yet complete, but its tremors were felt. Families whispered of shortages, of uncertainty, of the possibility of change. For Oniani, these whispers were not cause for despair, but for opportunity. He recognized that in times of upheaval, those who moved decisively could shape the future. And so, even as a young man, he began to position himself, not loudly, not recklessly, but with quiet calculation. By the end of this chapter, empathy gives way to unease. The listener understands the environment that birthed him, the poverty, the upheaval, the fractured communities, but also senses the darker path ahead. The boy who walked the streets of Tbilisi with quiet intensity would one day command fear across nations. The roots of power had been planted, and already they were beginning to grow. There is a hidden fraternity that has shaped the underworld of the Soviet Union and its successor states, a brotherhood that thrived in shadows, where silence was sacred and loyalty was absolute. This was the world of the thieves-in-law, the elite caste of organized crime, men who lived outside the law yet bound themselves to a code stricter than any statute written by the state. To speak of them is to speak of paradox. Criminals who rejected society's rules, yet who lived by rules of their own, rules that demanded reverence, obedience, and sacrifice. The thieves-in-law were not merely gangsters. They were custodians of a mythology, heirs to a lineage that stretched back through decades of prisons, wars, and revolutions. Their rituals were whispered in dim rooms, their oaths spoken in hushed tones, their symbols carved into skin and memory alike. To join them was not to gain freedom, but to accept chains, chains of loyalty, chains of silence, chains of belonging. For Tariel Oniani, entry into this world was not a choice made lightly. It was a step into inevitability, into a tradition that carried both honor and burden. The atmosphere of initiation was heavy, almost ritualistic. Imagine a room lit by a single bulb, its glow casting long shadows across faces etched with experience. Cigarette smoke curled upward, mingling with the scent of damp concrete and sweat. Men sat in silence, their eyes fixed, their expressions unreadable. In such a setting, words carried immense weight. An oath was not a mere promise. It was a binding of one's life to the brotherhood. To break it was to invite exile, or worse. The thieves-in-law carried with them a mythology born in the prisons of the Soviet Union. In those bleak institutions, where survival demanded cunning and resilience, the thieves-in-law emerged as leaders, arbiters, and symbols of defiance. Their tattoos told stories of allegiance, of battles fought, of codes upheld. A star inked on the shoulders meant authority. A cathedral etched across the chest spoke of years spent behind bars. Each mark was a declaration, a visible reminder of loyalty to the code. The code itself was paradoxical. It forbade cooperation with authorities, demanded loyalty to fellow thieves, and insisted upon a life lived outside conventional society. A thief-in-law could not marry, could not work in legitimate employment, could not serve the state. His life was to be lived entirely within the brotherhood, his loyalty absolute, his silence unbroken. Yet within this rejection of law, there was a strange reverence for order. Rules were strict, punishments severe, and hierarchy respected. It was a world where betrayal was unthinkable, where silence was sacred, and where honor existed in the shadows. Oniani's initiation was marked not by spectacle but by restraint. There were no grand ceremonies, no public declarations. Instead, there was silence, weight, and inevitability. He entered the brotherhood not as a conqueror, but as a participant in a tradition older than himself. The men around him were not merely allies. They were custodians of a code that demanded absolute loyalty. The psychology of belonging in this world was complex. To be a thief-in-law was to surrender individuality in exchange for identity. It was to accept that one's life was no longer one's own, but part of a collective bound by silence and ritual. For Oniani, this belonging carried both protection and burden. He gained allies, influence, and legitimacy within the underworld. Yet he also accepted chains, chains that bound him to rules stricter than any imposed by the state. The thieves-in-law were feared and respected in equal measure. In prisons, their word was law. In cities, their presence was felt in whispers. They were arbiters of disputes, guardians of tradition, and symbols of defiance against authority. To ordinary people, they were figures of mystery, men who lived outside society yet seemed to command it from the shadows. For Oniani, joining them meant stepping into this aura, becoming part of a mythology that carried both fascination and dread. The rituals of the thieves-in-law were steeped in symbolism. A man's initiation often involved the recognition of his past deeds, his loyalty tested in silence, his endurance proven through hardship. There were no written contracts, no official ceremonies. Instead, there was the weight of tradition, the presence of elders, and the unspoken understanding that once the oath was taken, life would never be the same. Oniani's initiation followed this path. He was observed, tested, and finally accepted, not with applause but with silence. The silence itself was powerful. In that room with smoke curling upward and shadows pressing down, silence was not emptiness. It was presence. It was the collective weight of men who had endured prisons, betrayals, and wars. It was the acknowledgement that words were fragile but silence was eternal. For Oniani, this silence was both burden and gift. It gave him belonging, but it also demanded obedience. The paradox of honor within lawlessness defined the thieves-in-law. They rejected the state, yet they created their own state within shadows. They rejected authority, yet they enforced authority among themselves. They rejected society, yet they shaped society from the margins. For Oniani, this paradox was not confusion, it was clarity. He understood that power lay not in legality, but in perception. To be feared, to be respected, to be obeyed, these were the true currencies of the underworld. By the end of this chapter, the listener understands that Oniani was not merely joining a criminal group. He was stepping into a centuries-old tradition, a mythology that carried both honor and burden. His initiation was not a moment of triumph, but a moment of inevitability. The chains of loyalty had been fastened, and already they were beginning to shape his destiny. Moscow in the 1990s was a city suspended between collapse and rebirth. The Soviet Union had dissolved, leaving behind a landscape of uncertainty, where old structures crumbled and new ambitions rose overnight. The streets carried the residue of history, yet they pulsed with the restless energy of change. Neon lights flickered above kiosks selling imported goods, while the skeletons of Soviet factories stood silent, their machinery rusting in the cold. It was a city of contradictions, glittering facades masking decay, promises of wealth mingling with the desperation of poverty. The atmosphere was electric, restless, and dangerous. Crowds surged through metro stations, their faces weary yet expectant. Western advertisements glowed on billboards, promising luxury and freedom, while beneath them beggars stretched out hands for coins. The scent of gasoline, cheap cigarettes, and rain-soaked concrete filled the air. Violence simmered beneath the surface, unspoken yet ever-present. Rival factions clashed quietly, their disputes settled not in courts but in alleys, restaurants, and hotel lobbies. It was a city where silence could be deadly, and where reputation was the most valuable currency. For Tariel Oniani, Moscow was not merely a destination, it was a stage. He arrived with charisma and ruthlessness, moving through the city's labyrinth with the calm assurance of someone who understood the psychology of power. His presence was magnetic. Men noticed him, respected him, feared him. He could negotiate with rivals, charm allies, and intimidate opponents, all without raising his voice. In a city where chaos reigned, his composure was itself a weapon. The rapid expansion of his influence reflected the energy of Moscow itself. Deals were struck in dimly lit restaurants, fortunes exchanged in briefcases, alliances formed in whispered conversations. Oniani positioned himself carefully among rival factions, never too exposed, never too hidden. He understood that survival in Moscow required balance, the ability to inspire trust while commanding fear, the ability to seize opportunity without appearing desperate. The city rewarded ambition, but it punished weakness. Those who hesitated were consumed by rivals, their empires dismantled overnight. Oniani thrived in this environment. His ruthlessness allowed him to act decisively, while his charisma ensured that others followed. He became a figure of both fear and respect, a man whose name carried weight in conversations across Moscow's underworld. The packing of this chapter reflects the city's energy, quicker, sharper, more urgent. The listener is guided through Moscow's streets, its neon lights, its collapsing structures, its restless crowds. Each image builds upon the last, creating a sense of momentum, of inevitability. Oniani's rise feels both opportunistic and destined, as though the city itself conspired to elevate him. Yet beneath the awe lies unease. The glittering facades conceal violence, the rapid expansion foreshadows danger. Ambition thrives in chaos, but unchecked power carries its own risks. Oniani's empire grew quickly, but the seeds of conflict were already present. Rival factions watched him carefully, law enforcement began to take notice, and the burden of maintaining control weighed heavily. The emotional tone balances fascination with foreboding. There is awe in the speed of his rise, in the charisma that allowed him to command respect, in the ruthlessness that ensured his survival. But there is also unease, a recognition that such ambition cannot remain unchecked forever. The listener senses that the very chaos that allowed Oniani to thrive will one day turn against him. Moscow itself was transforming at a dizzying pace. Privatization had unleashed a scramble for wealth, with state assets sold off to those bold enough to seize them. Oligarchs rose overnight, their fortunes built on oil, metals, and banking. Alongside them, criminal networks flourished, filling the vacuum left by weakened institutions. The police were underfunded, the courts unreliable, and the government itself riddled with corruption. In this environment, men like Oniani found fertile ground. He was not merely a gangster. He was a strategist, a man who understood that power in Moscow was fluid, shifting, and available to those willing to grasp it. His charisma was not theatrical but deliberate. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and carried himself with an authority that did not need to be shouted. Rivals recognized his ruthlessness, but they also recognized his ability to inspire loyalty. He could make allies feel indispensable while reminding them subtly that betrayal would be fatal. This duality, charm and menace, was the essence of his influence. The city's geography mirrored his rise. In the glittering hotels of Novi Arbat, deals were struck over champagne. In the shadowed corners of train stations, debts were collected with quiet efficiency. In the sprawling markets, counterfeit goods and smuggled luxuries changed hands under the watchful eyes of men loyal to Oniani. Each district carried its own rhythm, its own dangers, and he moved through them with calculated precision. Violence was never far away. Shootings erupted in restaurants, car bombs exploded in parking lots, and assassinations became part of the city's rhythm. Yet Oniani understood that raw violence was a blunt instrument. His power came not from chaos but from control. He used violence sparingly, strategically, ensuring that each act carried a message. Fear was most effective when it was measured, when it lingered in silence rather than in spectacle. The listener is drawn into this world with a sense of awe and unease. Moscow in the 1990s was a city of opportunity, but also a city of peril. It rewarded ambition but devoured the careless. Oniani's expansion into Moscow was both opportunistic and inevitable, a rise that carried within it the seeds of downfall. His empire grew quickly, but the very forces that elevated him, the chaos, the corruption, the hunger for power, were the same forces that threatened to consume him. By the end of this chapter, Moscow itself feels alive, restless, glittering, dangerous. It is not merely a backdrop but a character in its own right, shaping and being shaped by the men who sought to control it. Oniani's rise in this city was a story of charisma and ruthlessness, of opportunity seized and risks embraced. It was a story of ambition thriving in chaos, but also of the dangers that come when power grows unchecked. The listener is left with momentum, awe tempered by foreboding, as the narrative moves toward the height of his empire. Power in the criminal underworld is never held alone. It is woven through networks of alliances, fragile bonds that can elevate a man to influence or destroy him overnight. For Tariel Oniani, the path to dominance was not built solely on charisma or ruthlessness, but on the careful construction of relationships that stretched from the streets of Georgia to the hotel lobbies of Moscow, and eventually across Europe's shifting landscape of crime and commerce. The psychology of these alliances was complex. Trust was never absolute, loyalty never permanent. Each bond carried within it the seeds of betrayal, and every handshake was shadowed by suspicion. Men who entered into agreements with Oniani did so with the knowledge that their lives depended on promises that could dissolve in an instant. The underworld was a theater of masks, where words were whispered, gestures calculated, and silence often spoke louder than declarations. Meetings took place in dimly lit restaurants, where the clatter of cutlery masked the tension of negotiations. Cigarette smoke curled above tables as men leaned in close, their voices low, their eyes scanning the room for threats. Hotel lobbies became stages for whispered deals, where briefcases exchanged hands and promises were sealed with nods rather than signatures. In these spaces, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken rules. Respect must be shown, fear must be acknowledged, and betrayal must be anticipated. Oniani understood this world instinctively. He knew that alliances were not built on friendship but on necessity. A man allied with him might be a rival tomorrow, but in the moment, their bond was useful. He cultivated relationships with precision, offering protection to some, opportunity to others, and fear to all. His charisma allowed him to inspire confidence, while his ruthlessness ensured that betrayal carried consequences too severe to contemplate. Within Georgia, his alliances were rooted in shared history. Men who had grown up in the same neighborhoods, endured the same hardships, and navigated the same fractured society found themselves bound together by circumstance. Yet even these bonds were fragile. Poverty bred desperation, and desperation bred betrayal. Oniani's strength lay in his ability to anticipate these fractures, to sense when loyalty was wavering, and to act before weakness could spread. Beyond Georgia, his network expanded into Russia and Europe. In Moscow, he forged ties with factions that controlled markets, banks, and smuggling routes. In Western Europe, he connected with groups that dealt in narcotics, arms, and counterfeit goods. Each alliance was a thread in a larger web, a structure that gave him reach across borders. Yet each thread was delicate, vulnerable to tension, and capable of snapping under pressure. The packing of this chapter slows deliberately, allowing the listener to absorb the complexity of these alliances. The narrative lingers on the atmosphere of meetings, the psychology of trust and betrayal, the fragility of promises made in shadows. It is not a story of grand battles or dramatic confrontations, but of quiet tension, of men sitting across tables knowing that their survival depended on words spoken in whispers. The emotional tone is reflective, tinged with unease. There is fascination in the construction of these networks, in the way Oniani maneuvered through them with skill and calculation. Yet there is also recognition of their fragility. Every bond carried within it the seeds of destruction. Every alliance was temporary, conditional, and vulnerable. The listener senses that beneath the surface of Oniani's growing empire lies instability, a web that could unravel with a single betrayal. Oniani's genius lay not in eliminating betrayal but in managing it. He understood that men would falter, promises would break, and loyalties would shift. His strategy was to ensure that when betrayal occurred, it did not destroy him. He diversified his alliances, never relying too heavily on one faction, always maintaining alternatives. He spread influence across multiple networks, so that the collapse of one bond could be absorbed by the strength of others. This web of alliances was both protection and prison. It gave him reach, influence, and legitimacy within the underworld. But it also bound him to obligations, to promises that demanded fulfillment, to relationships that required constant maintenance. Every alliance carried expectations, and failure to meet them could invite retaliation. In this way, the very network that elevated him also constrained him, chaining him to the fragile promises of men whose loyalty was never guaranteed. The chapter's imagery reinforces this fragility. Dimly lit restaurants, whispered deals in hotel lobbies, tense silences in crowded marketplaces, all evoke the atmosphere of a world where trust was scarce and betrayal inevitable. The listener is drawn into these spaces, feeling the weight of tension, the fragility of promises, the constant awareness that every bond could break. By the end of this chapter, the listener understands that Oniani's power was not absolute. It was woven through fragile alliances, built on shifting sands of loyalty and fear. His empire was a web, intricate and expansive, but vulnerable to the smallest fracture. The seeds of destruction were already present, hidden within the very bonds that sustained him. The story moves forward with a sense of tension, of fragility, of inevitability, as the listener anticipates the unraveling that lies ahead. At the height of his influence, Tariel Oniani's name carried weight across borders. It was spoken in whispers in hotel lobbies, acknowledged in boardrooms, and feared in back alleys. His empire stretched into multiple industries: construction, banking, smuggling, and protection rackets, each thread woven into a vast network that gave him reach across continents. He was no longer merely a figure of the Georgian underworld or a rising force in Moscow. He had become a kingpin, a man whose reputation was cemented in the mythology of organized crime. The tone of his dominance was grand yet restrained. There was no need for spectacle, no need for flamboyant displays of wealth or violence. His power was measured in influence, in the ability to move unseen yet leave an indelible mark. Men who dealt with him understood that his reach was vast, his resources deep, and his patience limited. To cross him was to invite consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Oniani's empire was not confined to one city or one country. In Moscow, his presence was felt in construction projects that reshaped skylines, in financial institutions that laundered fortunes, and in markets where goods, both legal and illicit, changed hands under his watchful eye. In Georgia, his influence remained rooted in networks of loyalty and fear, binding communities to his authority. Across Europe, his connections extended into smuggling routes, narcotics trades, and alliances with other criminal factions. His reach was transnational, his reputation global. The packing of this chapter is steady, deliberate, allowing the listener to feel the gravity of his dominance. Each description builds upon the last, painting a portrait of a man whose rise had culminated in a position of immense power. Yet the narrative avoids glamour, acknowledging the scale of his reach without romanticizing it. His empire was vast, but it was built on foundations of fear, betrayal, and fragility. The psychology of power weighed heavily on him. To rise was one thing, to remain at the top was another. Every alliance demanded maintenance, every rival required monitoring, every opportunity carried risk. The burden of control was immense, and the higher the rise, the heavier the fall that loomed ahead. Oniani understood this inevitability. He knew that cracks were forming beneath the surface, that rivalries simmered, that law enforcement pressure was mounting. Yet he pressed forward, driven by ambition, sustained by charisma, and protected by ruthlessness. The atmosphere of his dominance was palpable. Imagine meetings in lavish restaurants, where men in tailored suits leaned across tables, their voices low, their eyes wary. Picture hotel lobbies where briefcases exchanged hands, where promises were sealed with nods rather than signatures. Envision construction sites where workers labored under contracts tied to his influence, their efforts shaping skylines that symbolized both progress and corruption. In each of these spaces, Oniani's presence was felt, even if unseen. His reputation was cemented not only by his actions but by the mythology that surrounded him. Stories circulated of his decisiveness, his ability to command fear without raising his voice, his capacity to inspire loyalty even among men who knew betrayal was inevitable. He became a symbol of inevitability, a figure whose rise seemed destined, whose dominance seemed unshakable. Yet within this mythology lay the seeds of downfall. The higher the rise, the heavier the fall. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Other factions watched his expansion with suspicion, waiting for opportunities to strike. Law enforcement, though often compromised, began to take notice, pressured by international agencies to confront the growing influence of men like Oniani. Within his own networks, cracks appeared as loyalties wavered, as ambition bred discontent, as fear gave way to desperation. The burden of maintaining control grew heavier, demanding constant vigilance, constant calculation, constant readiness to act. The emotional focus of this chapter is inevitability. The listener feels the weight of his dominance, the gravity of his empire, the awe of his reach. Yet alongside this awe lies unease, a recognition that such power cannot remain unchecked forever. The narrative hints at the fall to come, foreshadowing the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. Oniani's empire was vast, but it was also fragile. The construction projects that bore his influence were vulnerable to scrutiny. The financial institutions that laundered fortunes were exposed to investigation, and the smuggling routes that carried goods across borders were subject to disruption. Each success carried risk, each expansion invited attention, each alliance demanded loyalty that could falter. His dominance was immense, but it was never absolute. The higher he rose, the more isolated he became. Power demanded distance, demanded caution, demanded mistrust. Allies became tools, rivals became threats, and even friends became liabilities. The mythology of his dominance concealed the loneliness of command, the burden of knowing that every decision carried consequences measured not in profits but in lives. By the end of this chapter, Oniani stands at the height of his power. A kingpin whose name carried weight across borders, whose empire stretched into multiple industries, whose reputation was cemented in the mythology of organized crime. Yet the listener senses the cracks beneath the surface, the rivalries, the law enforcement pressure, the burden of maintaining control. The higher the rise, the heavier the fall. The story moves forward with a sense of inevitability, of awe tempered by foreboding, as the narrative approaches the turning point of his empire. The decline of an empire rarely begins with thunder. It begins with silence. It begins with whispers in corridors, with glances exchanged in dimly lit rooms, with the quiet erosion of trust. For Tariel Oniani, the turning tide was not marked by a single event, but by a series of subtle shifts, each one small, each one seemingly insignificant, yet together forming the undertow that would drag his empire toward collapse. Law enforcement intensified its pursuit. Surveillance became constant, invisible yet suffocating. Cars lingered too long outside restaurants. Faces appeared repeatedly in crowds, familiar yet unplaceable. Telephones carried echoes of listening ears. The state, once compromised and hesitant, began to move with greater determination, pressured by international agencies and emboldened by the growing awareness that Oniani's empire had become too vast to ignore. The hunter's gaze had sharpened, and the prey could feel its weight. Rival factions grew restless. Men who had once accepted his dominance began to question it. Alliances that had seemed solid began to fray. In hotel lobbies, conversations shifted from loyalty to doubt. In restaurants, whispers carried the possibility of betrayal. Fear, once the glue that held networks together, began to lose its grip. Ambition stirred in rivals, desperation stirred in allies, and the balance that had sustained his empire began to tilt. The imagery of this chapter is steeped in suspense. Picture dimly lit rooms where men sit in silence, their eyes darting, their hands restless. Imagine the hum of surveillance equipment, the quiet clicking of cameras hidden in corners, the steady rhythm of footsteps following too closely. Envision the slow disappearance of allies, men who once stood beside him now absent from meetings, their loyalty dissolved into silence. The atmosphere is heavy, deliberate, filled with tension that builds not through explosions but through erosion. Oniani felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. He had risen through charisma and ruthlessness, through alliances carefully cultivated and rivals carefully managed. But now the very structures that had elevated him began to falter. The burden of maintaining control grew heavier, demanding constant vigilance, constant calculation, constant readiness to act. Every decision carried consequences, every silence carried meaning, every absence carried threat. The psychology of decline is complex. For Oniani, it was not a sudden collapse but a gradual unraveling. He sensed betrayal before it was spoken. He felt suspicion before it was confirmed. His instincts sharpened, his paranoia deepened. Meetings became tests of loyalty, conversations became interrogations, gestures became signals to be deciphered. The empire that had once seemed vast and unshakable now felt fragile, vulnerable to fractures that spread quietly, invisibly, until they became impossible to contain. Law enforcement pressure intensified. Files were compiled, evidence gathered, networks mapped. International agencies coordinated efforts, determined to dismantle the empire that had stretched across borders. Raids struck at peripheral allies, arrests chipped away at his network, interrogations pried open cracks in loyalty. Each move was deliberate, each strike calculated, each silence filled with the knowledge that the net was tightening. Rival factions seized opportunities. They whispered promises to his allies, offered protection to his associates, dangled rewards before those tempted to betray. The underworld thrives on weakness, and Oniani's empire began to show signs of strain. Men who had once feared him began to consider alternatives. Rivals who had once respected him began to plot his downfall. The tide was turning, slowly but inexorably. The erosion was not only external but internal. Within his own ranks, fatigue set in. The constant vigilance demanded by his empire drained men of loyalty, leaving them vulnerable to temptation. Some disappeared quietly, slipping into anonymity. Others defected, carrying secrets into the hands of rivals or law enforcement. Each absence was a fracture, each betrayal a wound, each silence a reminder that the empire was no longer whole. The packing of this chapter is deliberate, reflecting the slow erosion of power. The listener is guided through scenes of surveillance, betrayal, and silence. Each image builds upon the last, creating a sense of inevitability, of tension that grows steadily, relentlessly. The downfall begins not with explosions but with whispers, not with battles but with absences, not with spectacle but with silence. The emotional focus is on inevitability and tension. There is awe in the scale of his empire, in the reach of his influence, in the mythology of his dominance. But there is also unease, a recognition that such power cannot remain unchecked forever. The listener feels the weight of decline, the inevitability of collapse, the tension of a tide that has begun to turn. By the end of this chapter, Oniani's empire stands on fragile ground. Law enforcement intensifies its pursuit, rival factions grow restless, alliances unravel, and allies disappear. The turning tide has begun, slow but unstoppable, deliberate but inevitable. The listener is left with a sense of suspense, of tension, of inevitability, as the narrative moves toward the collapse that now feels certain. The fall of a kingpin is rarely marked by spectacle. It is marked by silence. For Tariel Oniani, the moment of arrest was not a dramatic clash of forces, not a cinematic showdown in the streets. It was a quiet inevitability, the culmination of years of pursuit, betrayal, and erosion. The man who once commanded fear across borders now found himself confined within walls, his empire reduced to memory, his influence diminished to whispers. The arrest itself carried a strange stillness. There were no explosions, no frantic escapes, no desperate gunfire. Instead, there was the sound of footsteps, the rustle of uniforms, the click of handcuffs. Oniani, who had once moved through hotel lobbies with an aura of untouchable authority, now stood surrounded by men who carried the weight of the state. His composure remained, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a mask, a final gesture of defiance against inevitability. Imprisonment transformed him. The walls were unyielding, the routines monotonous, the silence oppressive. For a man who had thrived on movement, on negotiation, on the constant rhythm of power, confinement was a profound humiliation. The empire he had built stretched across industries and continents, yet within prison walls it meant nothing. Influence dissolved into isolation, reputation into irrelevance. The tone of this chapter is reflective, almost meditative. It does not glamorize his fall, nor does it dramatize his arrest. Instead, it lingers on the psychology of a man who once commanded fear, now confined to silence. The packing is slow, deliberate, emphasizing the contrast between his former power and his present isolation. Oniani's mind became his prison as much as the walls around him. He replayed decisions, reconsidered alliances, revisited betrayals. The paranoia that had once sharpened his instincts now became a torment, gnawing at him in solitude. Every silence carried echoes of voices lost. Every shadow carried memories of men who had once stood beside him. The empire that had seemed vast and unshakable now existed only in recollection, fragile and fading. The psychology of confinement is humbling. For Oniani, it was the recognition that even kings of the underworld are subject to time and fate. His charisma, his ruthlessness, his alliances, all had carried him to the height of power. Yet none could shield him from the inevitability of decline. The walls reminded him daily that power is transient, that fear dissolves, that influence fades. The imagery of this chapter is steeped in silence. Picture the narrow corridors of prison, the clang of doors closing, the echo of footsteps fading into distance. Imagine the small cell, its walls bare, its window barred, its air heavy with monotony. Envision Oniani sitting alone, his gaze fixed on nothing, his thoughts circling endlessly. The atmosphere is heavy, deliberate, filled with the weight of inevitability. The emotional focus is humility. The listener feels the contrast between the man who once commanded fear and the man now confined to silence. There is awe in the scale of his former empire, but there is also recognition of its fragility. The narrative shows how even the most powerful are subject to decline, how even kings of the underworld are humbled by time and fate. Exile followed imprisonment. Removed from the centers of power, distanced from the networks that had sustained him, Oniani became a figure of memory rather than presence. His name still carried echoes, but they were echoes of the past, not declarations of the present. The man who had once shaped cities and commanded networks now lived in isolation, his influence reduced to stories whispered in corridors. Exile was not only geographic but symbolic. It represented his removal from relevance, his transformation from actor to spectator. He could no longer shape events, no longer command loyalty, no longer dictate terms. He became a relic, a reminder of a past era, a cautionary tale whispered among those who still navigated the underworld. His exile was not marked by distance alone, but by irrelevance. The packing remained slow, deliberate, allowing the listener to absorb the gravity of his fall. Each description builds upon the last, painting a portrait of a man whose rise had culminated in confinement, whose dominance had dissolved into silence. The narrative avoids spectacle, focusing instead on inevitability, on the quiet erosion of power, on the humility of exile. Oniani's story in this chapter is not one of defiance but of acceptance. He did not rage against the walls, did not plot elaborate escapes, did not cling desperately to illusions of power. Instead, he sat in silence, reflecting on the inevitability of decline. His composure remained, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a mask, a gesture of dignity in the face of inevitability. By the end of this chapter, Oniani stands not as a kingpin but as a prisoner, not as a figure of fear but as a man confined by walls. His empire has dissolved, his influence has faded, his reputation has become memory. The listener is left with a sense of humility, of inevitability, of recognition that even the most powerful are subject to decline. The story moves forward with a sense of closure, of awe tempered by reflection, as the narrative approaches the final consequences of his empire. The legacy of Tariel Oniani is not measured in monuments or official histories. It is measured in whispers. It lingers in the corridors of prisons, in the conversations of men who once feared him, in the stories told in hushed tones across Georgia, Russia, and beyond. His name became a symbol of both fear and fascination, a reminder of the paradox of power, that it can dominate lives, shape societies, and yet dissolve into myth once the man himself is gone. In Georgia, his legacy was deeply intertwined with the fractured identity of a nation emerging from Soviet collapse. For some, he represented defiance against authority, a figure who thrived outside the structures of state power. For others, he was a predator, a man whose empire fed on weakness and whose influence corrupted communities. His name carried weight in both directions, admiration and condemnation, fascination and dread. Beyond Georgia, his story became part of the broader history of organized crime in the post-Soviet world. The thieves-in-law tradition, the networks of smuggling and extortion, the alliances that stretched across borders, all found embodiment in Oniani's rise and fall. He was not merely a criminal figure. He was a symbol of an era, a man whose life reflected the chaos, ambition, and fragility of the post-Soviet transition. The tone of this chapter is contemplative, asking what remains when power fades. Reputation, myth, silence. Oniani's empire dissolved, his influence diminished, his presence confined to exile. Yet his name endured, carried in whispers, remembered in stories, invoked as both warning and legend. The listener is invited to reflect on the echoes of his life, on the way figures like Oniani live on long after their fall. The packing is reflective, deliberate. The narrative lingers on memory, on myth, on the fragile persistence of reputation. It does not rush toward conclusion, but allows the listener to absorb the complexity of legacy, to consider the ways in which power endures even after it has dissolved. Oniani's legacy is paradoxical. He is remembered as both kingpin and prisoner, as both strategist and exile, as both symbol of defiance and cautionary tale. His story intertwines with the mythology of the thieves-in-law, with the broader narrative of organized crime in the post-Soviet world, with the fragility of power itself. He became part of a lineage, a figure whose rise and fall echoed those who came before and foreshadowed those who would come after. The emotional focus is on memory and myth. There is awe in the scale of his former empire, fascination in the charisma that carried him to dominance, unease in the ruthlessness that sustained him. Yet there is also recognition of fragility, of inevitability, of the way power dissolves into silence. His legacy is not one of triumph but of shadow, of whispers that linger long after the man himself has faded. The imagery of this chapter is steeped in echoes. Picture men in prison corridors speaking his name with caution. Imagine conversations in restaurants where his story is invoked as warning. Envision communities in Georgia where his influence is remembered with both fear and fascination. The atmosphere is heavy, contemplative, filled with the recognition that legacy is not built on permanence but on memory. His name became a kind of currency in the underworld. To invoke it was to summon both respect and caution. Younger criminals spoke of him as a legend, a figure whose rise embodied ambition and whose fall embodied inevitability. Older men remembered him with a mixture of admiration and regret, recalling the charisma that had drawn them in and the ruthlessness that had kept them bound. His legacy was not static. It shifted depending on who spoke it, where it was spoken, and why. In exile, Oniani himself became a shadow of his former presence. He lived in isolation, distanced from the networks that had once sustained him. Yet even in absence, his name carried weight. Law enforcement continued to cite him as a symbol of organized crime's reach. Communities continued to whisper his story as both warning and fascination. His exile did not erase his legacy. It transformed it into myth. The broader history of the post-Soviet underworld ensured that his story endured. He was part of a generation that rose in the chaos of collapse, that thrived in the vacuum left by weakened institutions, that built empires on fear and ambition. His legacy became inseparable from that history, a reminder of the fragility of power and the inevitability of decline. By the end of this chapter, the listener understands that Oniani's legacy is not confined to his empire or his exile. It is woven into the mythology of organized crime, into the history of the post-Soviet world, into the whispers that carry his name long after his fall. His story endures not as spectacle but as shadow, not as triumph but as memory. The narrative closes with reflection, with recognition, with the understanding that figures like Oniani live on in whispers, in myths, in shadows. Rain fell softly over Tbilisi, as if the city itself were exhaling after decades of turbulence. The streets glistened under the dim glow of street lamps, each drop tracing invisible lines across the pavement, washing away the dust of memory. It was a familiar image, echoing the opening scene of this story, a reminder that beginnings and endings often share the same silence. The rain did not announce itself with thunder or storm. It arrived quietly, steadily, as if to remind those who watched that history is written not in spectacle but in whispers. The city carried its own scars. Buildings bore the marks of collapse and rebirth, their facades cracked yet enduring. Bridges stretched across the river like veins, carrying the lifeblood of a restless population. In the rain, Tbilisi seemed timeless, suspended between past and present, between memory and forgetting. It was here that Tariel Oniani's story began, and it was here that it found its closure, not in monuments or headlines, but in the quiet rhythm of water falling over stone. Oniani's rise had been marked by ambition, charisma, and ruthlessness. His fall had been marked by silence, betrayal, and inevitability. Now in the rain, his legacy dissolved into myth. Footprints faded from the streets, voices softened into echoes, and the empire that had once stretched across borders became a shadow carried only in memory. The rain washed away the traces of power, leaving behind whispers in the night. The tone of this epilogue is contemplative, poetic, timeless. It does not seek to dramatize his life or glorify his empire. Instead, it lingers on the paradox of power, that it can dominate lives, shape societies, and yet dissolve into silence once the man himself is gone. The rain becomes a metaphor for inevitability, for the way time erodes even the strongest structures, for the way memory outlasts presence. The packing is slow, deliberate, allowing the listener to drift into contemplation. Each image builds upon the last, creating a rhythm that mirrors the steady fall of rain. The narrative does not rush toward conclusion but allows space for reflection, for silence, for the recognition that closure is not found in spectacle but in acceptance. Oniani's story is part of a larger story, the story of ambition in chaos, of power in fragility, of inevitability in rise and fall. His empire was vast, his influence immense, his reputation cemented in myth. Yet his end was quiet, his exile humbling, his legacy reduced to whispers. The rain over Tbilisi reminds us that even the most powerful are subject to time, that even kings of the underworld are humbled by silence. The imagery of this chapter is steeped in reflection. Picture the streets of Tbilisi glistening under rain, the river carrying its waters steadily, the city breathing in silence. Imagine the echoes of footsteps fading, the voices of men who once spoke his name now softened into memory. Envision the rain washing away footprints, leaving only whispers in the night. The atmosphere is heavy, contemplative, filled with the recognition that legacy is not permanence but shadow. The emotional focus is on silence and inevitability. There is awe in the scale of his former empire, fascination in the charisma that carried him to dominance, unease in the ruthlessness that sustained him. Yet there is also recognition of fragility, of inevitability, of the way power dissolves into silence. His story closes not with spectacle but with rain, not with triumph but with reflection, not with permanence but with whispers. The rain becomes a symbol of closure. It washes away the traces of ambition, the marks of betrayal, the scars of empire. It leaves behind only memory, only myth, only silence. In this way, the city itself participates in the story, carrying forward the echoes of his life while erasing the footprints of his presence. The rain is both ending and beginning, both erasure and renewal, both silence and continuity. The city itself seemed to breathe with the rain. The old neighborhoods with their narrow streets and wooden balconies absorbed the water like sponges, their histories refreshed yet blurred. The modern districts with their glass towers and neon lights reflected the rain in fractured patterns, as if to remind the viewer that progress too is fragile, that even steel and glass can be softened by time. Tbilisi became a canvas, painted anew with each drop, carrying both the memory of Oniani's rise and the inevitability of his fall. In the rain, myths endure. Men in prison corridors still spoke his name with caution, invoking him as both warning and legend. Younger generations who had not lived through his reign heard stories of his charisma and ruthlessness, stories that blurred fact and fiction until they became indistinguishable. His legacy lived not in monuments but in whispers, not in permanence but in myth. The rain carried those whispers forward, scattering them across the city, embedding them in its rhythm. By the end of this chapter, the listener understands that Oniani's story is not confined to his empire or his exile. It is woven into the mythology of organized crime, into the history of the post-Soviet world, into the whispers that carry his name long after his fall. His story endures not as spectacle but as shadow, not as triumph but as memory. The rain over Tbilisi becomes the final image, the closing circle, the reminder that even the most powerful dissolve into silence. The narrative closes with reflection, with recognition, with the understanding that figures like Oniani live on not in monuments but in whispers, not in permanence but in myth, not in triumph but in shadows. The rain falls softly, steadily, endlessly, carrying forward the echoes of his life while washing away the traces of his empire. In the end, there is no spectacle, no thunder, no storm, only rain, only silence, only inevitability.